that like literally? Are you saying in the Hebrew or in the? I don't.
In the Hebrew, why is it spelled Adonai instead of Yud He Vav He? All right, so Julia, so I think I know this one. So Julia's question, for those of you watching at home,
yes,
is that on 46, the name of God, Adonai, is written out. Now, some of you who have taken my intro class, you've heard my spiel, so I will sort of do it briefly. And I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but we know that the name of God is not Adonai. Adonai means my master. And so sometimes, and I think specifically in Psalm 51, it is written out the words my master. Adon means master, and if you have a yud at the end, it means mine. So usually when we have God's name in the prayer book or even in the Torah, it's written Yud He Vav He. You might in English say like YHWH. And that we think is the like ineffable name of God, which if you were going to guess, it might be Yahweh, but we don't really know what that name is. And in fact, if someone in the Orthodox community would never even say Yahweh, whatever it is, it's this idea.
In academia.
In academia, you can absolutely say it because we feel like we don't really know what the name of God is.
Is referred to as Yahweh.
Right. But this one specifically in the Psalm, it says Adonai written out, and so that's why they can write it here. But usually in our prayers, you'll just see Yud He Vav He, and then they'll have certain vowels under it, so we know to read it Adonai. But it is a good question. It's confusing a little bit. Okay, so when we go in,
No, I will come back to it. I want to compare it to a traditional text. I think that's a great question. I didn't recognize that. Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay, so if you go to 48. So this, oh my gosh, it takes us so long to get through it. Okay, so if you go to 48, we're not going to spend forever on this, but what, we sometimes we talk about this even in prayers, when we talk on Shabbat together, we talk about this idea that this blesses, this offers praise to the God of our ancestors. And, I like to say is that specifically each ancestor is named of the matriarchs and patriarchs to remind us of the idea that they each had the relationship with God, and so do we. One of the questions that we love to be asked, and someone asked us just like 2 weeks ago. So again, if you were in a more traditional synagogue, or if you grew up even Reform anytime until maybe the 90s, maybe it's the 80s. I don't know. Yeah, for a very long time, you would only hear them say Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov, only the names of the patriarchs. And then when the prayer book that preceded this one came out, it was called the Gates of Repentance. We refer to it as the Gates of Blue. I guess this one's blue too, but that's what we called it. And there was also a shorter version called the Gates of Gray. I think it's also called Gates of Repentance, but that's how we refer to them. Decided that we needed to include the matriarchs as well. The funniest thing about it, though, was that if you learn this prayer with the matriarchs growing up, they were in a different order. We said Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel because that's the order in which they became the matriarchs, and
that's their appearance in Torah.
Right.
Yes.
But when they rewrote this prayer book, they changed it around because it rhymes better this way. Isn't that the worst? I can't even believe that that's the reason for it. It's really upsetting.
Also, there's the last matriarch, Leah, that is mentioned. The word after Leah is Ha'el. So Leah is spelled Lamed Aleph He, and Ha'el is He Aleph Lamed. It's kind of palindromic. So they thought that would be clever too. So let's go with that's
right. Carla. It's not, even though it clearly seems
that's a good covenant.
It seems that it's that Rachel is more important, and we know that Rachel was the more beloved of the two. But also, that's so jerky, right? That she should be replaced. So part of why we share this with you, though, is that real human beings made these decisions, and they made them in our lifetime. So when Rabbi Michael and I were in rabbinical school was when they were editing this prayer book. And so they would bring us, as students, the prayer book to see what we thought about it. And obviously you can tell what we thought. We thought that this prayer was really stupid, but we lost. So other people really liked it. But it's just interesting to know that is how prayers change over time, is that a bunch of rabbis get together, they think it's a good idea, they ask some other rabbis, and then they do whatever the heck you want. And then people grow up up being like, I guess this is how the prayer goes, even if maybe for 2,000 years it was different.
We can look at the Gevurot if timeout.
Yeah.
Are we going out of order?
No, it's cool. That's next.
All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Do you want to do it? So there are a few things, and you'll see it on the next page too, that are little words that either they're said for a specific holiday. Now this one, the words look weird, but you'll know the tune. This one goes, Zochreinu lechayim, melech hafetz b'chayim. We usually only hear that melody on the high holidays because Shabbat Shuvah is the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So that you only say that particular time of year. But if you go to the next page, and Rabbi Michael's going to talk about Gevurot, you'll see, again, another Shabbat Shuvah thing, but also you'll see there's something in the beginning that says winter and summer at the top of page 50. That is another thing that you might hear in a more traditional prayer service that we do not do. But when they created Mishkan Tefillah, they wanted to give people some options, so that if you wanted to add in some traditions that they might have in a more Orthodox service, but that we don't do here, you had the choice of doing it.
So if you will turn to page 50, you will see on paper the actual tension that exists between traditional prayer and the Reform movement's attempt to try to change prayer itself. The first is that this is a prayer about resurrection. Maimonides, in his last ideas about Judaism and his last specific points about Judaism, according to many of our professors, relents and acknowledges that resurrection of the body is not only possible, but is inevitable and will be part of the scope of Jewish history. And that will come along with the experience of the redemption. This is a very controversial idea to anyone who has any sense of a scientific background or a sense of what it is to live in the modern period. The other idea, and I don't want to get into too much discussion about it, is a bit of a polemic with the tension that exists simply with the idea of resurrection within Judaism. Formally and traditionally, Judaism has never had any departure with the concept of resurrection. But I was taught resurrection is a taboo thing. We don't talk about it. We don't discuss it. That's for them. This is for us. And it turns out that, of course, as we grow and we study the traditional prayers, we realize that this is a major concept in the Jewish faith. And you can see at the top of the page, the first part in parentheses is the word metim. It's in English. Metim means the dead. So Ata Gibor Le'olam Adonai, you are forever mighty. You give life to all and revive the dead. There are times when we are leading services and Rabbi Fader will say, Michaye Hakol, and I will say Michaye Metim. And then there are times when I feel like it's more important for us to be in harmony and that we present harmonically the idea of Michaye Hakol. But again, if you look on the page, the Reform movement has not been able to resolve this tension. It revisited it in our time and is saying, we're not sure how we feel about it anymore. The second thing is this. There's an additional insert for winter and summer prayers. Anything having to do with agriculture was taken out. And the idea that we now will pray for rain is a very revolutionary notion in the Reform movement. This is something that we did not do because we understood, based on our Enlightenment ideas, that this is not something that is a necessity. We don't need to pray for rain. That's an ancient reliquary agricultural idea.
The other piece I would just add about the Michaye piece is that this is where Hebrew becomes a real challenge, not for us, but for people who are native Hebrew speakers. Because Michaye Hakol doesn't really mean anything. Mechaye, the word mechaye, it's not like if you had a baby, you mechayed them, right? Like mechaye actually means brings back to life. So if you're going to say, God, thank you for bringing back to life everything, it doesn't really make any sense. That basically is still saying resurrection, right? So it's fine for us if we're not native Hebrew speakers. We say mechaye hakol, and we don't even think about it. But when the Reform movement came to Israel, this was extremely hard for Israelis because they know exactly what this means. And you'll find even to this day that a lot of the issue that Israelis have, that more secular Israelis have with Judaism, is that they know what they're saying. And sometimes they know if it sounds like a bunch of BS. It's super interesting, actually. Here, our daughter has a very good friend. Actually, both of our kids have friends who are Israelis.
Different families.
But our daughter has a good friend who is Israeli and whose family is completely secular. And they have started sending her to Hebrew school here because they want her to know Hebrew. But they really don't want her reading these prayers because they know what they say and they're very uncomfortable with it. And it's sort of an interesting challenge that Israelis have because it doesn't ring true with them, and they know too much.
Can I say? Yeah. I just want to posit one more philosophical or spiritual idea, and that is that it is important within a prayer service to acknowledge that you're not going to live forever. And that you're not running the train. And that we'd like to think that actually helps us, gives us a sense of calm and a sense of ease, because it would be terrifying to think about all the time. But I do believe that there is a kavanah, that there is an intention, that you realize that you are given a certain amount of time and that you are made of flesh and blood like anyone who has ever lived, and that there is something greater than you. And that thing that is greater than you can be given the name God. And having that moment of humility, and I believe the Renaissance painters, they would call it memento mori, just the idea that remember you are mortal, is a very important idea. And quite frankly, we have an aversion to speaking about death or acknowledging death, in particular within our older services. And I think now this is a step towards something that truly frightens us, but that we're trying to acknowledge, which is that we are only human and that we'd like to think that we're in control of everything, but we're not. So
I want to get I want to get back to tefillah, to this. Remember, it's either called tefillah, the prayer of votes, which means the ancestors, or Shemona Esrei. The Shemona Esrei piece is that during the weekday, you would say this prayer, and there are 19 different blessings in it. Again, Shemona Esrei means 18, but who's counting? But the idea of these blessings that you say during the week, there are a lot of additional ones that we don't say on Shabbat. There is a blessing that talks about the restoration of the Davidic monarchy, right? That we're all waiting for King David and all of his generations to come back. There is a prayer that talks about, we have obviously rewritten this one, but about, sorry, I'm trying to think of how to say this in a nice way, about that, like, Gentiles, not that they should become Jewish, but like that they should go far away. I mean, it's not very nice. So we have rewritten those. But
we have to understand Jewish history and human history. When did the state of Israel come into existence?
Right.
When did Jews have a safe place to live that they could send their kids to public school?
Right.
We look back and we see things as uninformed, and it's just simply not the case. Their words are a reflection of the world that they saw around them and the way that they were treated in that world. Israel as a nation did not exist. We lived amongst the nations, and the nations treat us with great oppression, with great prejudice, and the word exile is an important theme, both in terms of history and in terms of spirituality. And the interplay between the experience of, look, we lived in exile for thousands of years, and the idea that you can get on a 747 now and go to, God willing, in a few months, and go to Tel Aviv and have a tropical drink, that is beyond the comprehension of anyone before 1948. It's something that people did with chutzpah to live in, but it didn't happen. It didn't exist. And we often look back on that and we say, how could we have such enmity and hatred and feel so xenophobic? It's because we were terrified and we were often the subjects of tremendous xenophobia. So the historian in me just couldn't let, but there is a notion that in the Shemona Esrei that a lot of these are historical responses as well.
So the other thing that we talked about briefly last time, but I want to say again now, is that Shemona Esrei is a prayer that if you were to go to a more traditional synagogue, they're going to do it twice. And the first time they will do it silently, and that is theoretically to make sure that no one feels ashamed that they don't know the words. And so you're supposed to be able to look around and say, oh, no one's really saying it. It's okay. So if you don't know Hebrew, if you weren't literate, you wouldn't feel ashamed. Then the prayer leader, who could be a rabbi, but is not necessarily. You don't have to be a rabbi to be a shaliach tzibur, a person who leads a prayer service, will go through it, and will go through it very quickly. And sometimes if you're going to a more Orthodox service, that can be super alienating because you're like, they're going so fast, how do they even know what they're saying? And all I would say is even if it feels alienating, that is okay. The idea is truly that they are saying it to themselves and they know these words so well that it's almost like a meditation. So if you go to a more traditional service, you should never feel ashamed that you can't do it as fast as anyone else. Just like if you're coming to a service here, don't feel ashamed if you don't know all the words. In a more observant community, it is almost more like a kind of meditation. The one prayer that I would point out, if you go to 60, because remember last time I talked about how there's different versions of certain songs. So you always have this prayer for peace. This we say Shalom Rav in the evenings. In the mornings, we sing Sim Shalom. Both of them are beautiful, but sometimes people will say, oh, can't we do Sim Shalom on a Friday night? And I'm like, nope. But the only reason for it is literally that's just historically what you do. Sim Shalom is a morning prayer. Shalom Rav is an evening prayer. There's not something that is more morning-y or evening-y about them. In fact, those two particular prayers, we know that when the prayer service was first compiled, remember last time I told you that this guy, Sadia Gaon, around 600, wrote one of the first prayer books. There was another rabbi who was writing one at the same time somewhere else in Ashkenaz. And so when they really put together a Siddur, they did bits and pieces of everyone's service. And they were like, these prayers are both so good. Let's include them both. And so they did. And so one got pegged as a morning prayer and one is an evening prayer, but there's no real reason for it. So what I want to do now is go to the prayer. And every Friday night I say this, but I'm going to say it again. We now turn to page 253. We skip forward in our prayer service. And this is for the Mishaberach. So Mishaberach is a healing prayer. And this is a prayer, and forgive me because I feel like I've given this sermon so many times, but it still is important to hear, is that this is not a traditional Friday night prayer. This is really a prayer that you usually only do when the Torah is out. By the way, Rabbi, when do we read Torah?
Multiple times a week.
Yes.
On market days.
Exactly. So the market day.
People can hear it because that's where the Torah is read. Not in a nice synagogue with nice air conditioning, but in the marketplace because nobody knew the Torah. So you should do it publicly and broadcast it.
So in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is when we know the Torah was first read publicly, you would go to market on the Sabbath, but also not to buy stuff, but on the Sabbath, but on Mondays and Thursdays.
What day is Soulard open? What days are Soulard?
Every day, isn't it?
Soulard's open every day?
Oh, is it not? Oh, I don't know.
Huh.
I only go on Sundays.
Market days.
But so it would be just market days, and then that's how we know the Torah was read then, because Ezra talks about this idea that he would go there in the marketplace and he would read from this scroll. So Monday, even now, if you were to go to a daily minyan, a daily service, you could hear Torah read on Mondays and Thursdays and on Shabbat. But when it comes to this Mishaberach is a healing prayer, and it's not traditionally one that you would do on a Friday night. And the only reason that we do this here is because of Debbie Friedman. So Debbie Friedman was a songwriter, and she, grew up Reform and started at Onseng Ruby Union Institute, the big Reform summer camp where Rob Litz went. And Debbie was really a remarkable songwriter. And part of what she did that was so cool is a lot of her songs are actually they have like Torah chant in them. I mean, she really like knew her stuff and was an excellent musician. Not a great singer, by the way, but a very, very good songwriter. And when Debbie Friedman wrote a tune to this Mishaberach, it spread like wildfire within the liberal Jewish community. And people, it speaks to them in a way that like no other prayer does, I think, in modern Judaism, to the point that we do it in every service, and God forbid we should do a different version of the Mishaberach that Debbie Friedman didn't write. People feel insulted. Like, so, I mean, we never do it. Yeah, Carla. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So what Carla said, for those watching from home, is that she heard from someone who's Orthodox this idea that it's kind of shocking to say the Mishaberach because you're not supposed to ask God for stuff on Shabbat because God should get a rest too, right? But that's
we don't say Mishaberach during the Torah service on a Saturday morning. Can we check
so that's
back
interesting.
with you? Can I check because that's an interesting. I get any kind of shock of doing something out of order, especially without the Torah. But I'm not sure if we don't traditionally say the Mishaberach reading the Torah on a Saturday morning.
I mean, we do, but I don't know.
No, but I'm thinking
anymore.
about Tzfat. I'm thinking about Tzfat. I remember.
I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah.
So yeah, Jeopardy points, double Jeopardy. Very nice. Thank you.
But just to put out there, like, this is one of those things that has become so important to us that we would never not do it. And it's probably one that will continue.
Yeah, it has become keva.
Yes. Yeah. And it really, like, for those of us who don't know us well, when we were installed at Temple Israel, Debbie Friedman came and did the installation, which was like amazing. And then she died just a few weeks later. So she died very young and still has like a remarkable treasure trove of songs that are out there. And they ended up naming the cantorial school after her posthumously. But even that was interesting because for so long, the Jewish music community hated her stuff because, again, she wasn't a great singer. Her songs are relatively easy, even though she always has this one like really challenging chord that Rabbi Michael's always like, Debbie. Yeah. Like, she has a few tough chords that she threw in there. But she intended for her songs to be very, very singable. There's nothing that's super high or super low or that takes any sort of, great musical skill. And so they were not a fan for a long time, but they sort of moved on past that.
So can I say one more praise of Debbie and then acknowledge one more thing about the Mishaberach? I don't know that we said many prayers for healing before this, historically, in our service. I don't remember growing up with the Mishaberach at all, in any service at all. And I think the idea that there's been a kind of turning the light on the idea of a prayer service as a place for healing is very, very important and has been one of the best developments of our movement. And it's just this acknowledgement that we all come here for many, as you say every Friday night, we all come here for many reasons, but very much at the bottom of it all, underneath it lies our desire, our hope for healing and renewal. And I think it's great and can never be said enough. I actually think it's almost difficult because Debbie created the one song. It's like the Doors created the soundtrack for certain, and nobody can create the soundtrack for other different periods in history. I feel like I've seen different movies talking about this, but the idea is basically I would hope that there would be more prayers for healing, and it's almost insurmountable because she made the song. The other thing I just want to acknowledge about Debbie Friedman is she's amazing at Hebrew, and one of the things that she did was she actually changed the words into the feminine. So for L'Simchat Chaim. What's
Lechilach.
Lechilach. Mm-hmm. So one of Debbie Friedman's songs, she entirely took the Torah and put it in the feminine. Like she did the thing that we were talking, which she took the primary source out of the Torah, Lech Lecha from Abraham, and put it in the feminine. That was just like amazing and quite a revolutionary step. Yeah. I grew up singing that. Yeah, powerful lesson.
Okay. So little time, so much shit. Okay, so do we even talk about this, or is that too much?
Let's come back if God willing.
All right. So what we're going to do is skip forward a little bit, so we at least get to the end of the service, because these are the prayers that we do every single time we're together. So we at least want you to know why we do them. So on page 282. This is where we do the prayer that we call Aleinu. And we talked about this a little bit last time about sort of how you know when to bow and when not to. And I said that generally speaking, I'm not a bower. Like, I don't usually do that extra stuff. I do bow during the Aleinu because it literally says in the prayer, we bend the knee and bow. So that to me seems like, oh, that's actually what I'm saying. I am going to do it there. And so this is one that we're supposed to rise. We face the ark. And then when we say va'anachnu korim, that means and we bow, bend our knees. And so that's when we bow facing the ark. Now, there is a tradition that says that you should rise up again when you say lifnei melech, which means before the king. And even though the king in this case is talking about God, that it's supposed to be a reminder to us that the only king who we bow to as Jews is God and never actually a king, right?
It's interesting because someone asked, a young person asked on Friday night, why do we bow in front of the Torah? So I think that was just I was acknowledging that question. Also the language. Do you want to talk about history? The Holocaust.
Oh, I don't even know where you're going with that.
Okay, so two things. The first is that we're using the language of royalty. There are three words. Aleinu l'shabeach ladona kol. So we. We're using the behavior that one would use in front of a royal, which is something that people in older times would have been more familiar with. And that is the idea of bowing. This is important because when Jews came to this country, there was always a question of their loyalty. This is the same for Catholics as well, just to point out that it was a common problem. But yes, there was always this question of to whom is your loyalty? And bowing towards the Torah is a very important thing. Also processing with the Torah and lifting the Torah up, as Rabbi Amy did, were pretty much not part of the Reform culture. And I grew up without those things. So all of those were aesthetics of what looked like to the early Reformers as the actual worshiping of a book, like literally bowing down in front of an idol or a book, or carrying the Torah around during the Torah processional, and everybody reaching out, if anybody has had the experience to reach out and touch it or kiss it. This was seen by the founders of Reform Judaism as idol worship, and was not done.
And I would say not just the founders. I mean, for those of you who grew up with Rabbi Shook or Rabbi Rubin, this was something I
didn't
remember.
Want to implicate anybody.
Yeah, no, I remember Rabbi Shook said, like, as long as I'm the rabbi here, we will not be bringing the Torah out to the congregation because it's idol worship. And so, so that's only one generation ago that it's a pretty recent change.
But it is based on an intellectual premise. But our approach is based on a premise as well, which is essentially that the Torah cannot be withheld from the people. It doesn't stay on Mount Sinai. You take it down and you reenact the sacred moment of revelation so that you can get to redemption, which is what the Aleinu is. That is the cosmic end of the story where we are all redeemed. God is made king over all. Every knee shall bow. To whom? To a higher power, not to all the things that we bow down to now. And I think there was this idea, and I would say lastly, and I want to call on you, Mark, lastly, that after the Second World War, before the Second World War, there was a question, is this something we should include? That God will come back, and it's too messianic. And the answer after the Second World War was yes, we're going to bring back the messianic. And we will have, and this prayer is messianic. It's about the redemption of the world via a Messiah. We've cut out and kind of edited a bit and don't say the word Messiah exactly. But the idea is history had a beginning, it had a middle, which was Revelation, the Torah service, and its end is redemption, the Elenium. And that will be the idea is you've now traveled through many doorways, and you're now going to go into the future, into the end of history.
Yeah, Mark.
Mark. Intelligence and wit.
Right.
When we do that service, which is one of my favorite ones, and then when you bring it out, you have different people bringing out different words, and people touch them or kiss them, like you said, but they touch them and they touch the book to them. Is there a symbolism behind that, or is it they don't want to get it dirty, they don't want to get it oily, they don't?
Yeah. So the service you're talking about is Simchat Torah. That one is a little bit different because that is when we finish the last lines of Deuteronomy and we start all over with the book of Genesis. And that one, and this is not done everywhere, but this is just something that we do here, is we try to take out the Torah and unroll the whole thing so people can see it. But yes, there is just something about the idea that because you're not supposed to touch a scroll with your hands, that they do it sort of out of respect. That one, I think the earlier reformers and Rabbi Shook would think is a little bit different, because then it's really seeing sort of the artistry of the Torah and honoring this idea that you're starting and starting over again, rather than you're taking it out and marching it around like everyone gets to touch the baby, which I love, frankly. I think it's really cool, but it's right. So what you're supposed to do is you're actually supposed to hold it like this so that your fingers don't touch it.
What we do by unrolling the entire scroll is a no-no.
Yeah.
It's really not. It damages the scroll. It's not really permissible under most circumstances. What our kavanah is to like, people often ask, like, how long is the scroll? And just for the sake of curiosity, for the fun of it, just being able to do something like that has been powerful. But yeah, I think so too. I agree. Yeah.
I mean, so there's not, because unfortunately, like, we have torn scrolls before, and it's
you can get them repaired though. We have a sofer. They come from Chicago, and they've come in and fixed our scrolls and even cleaned them up. They use a white gummy eraser sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you have a question also? I mean, there's not necessarily, and part of it, like, I guess 2 years ago, maybe, Rabbi Michael had a program that he called Holy Rollers that was for people to come and roll the Torah, because Torahs, because they're made out of parchment, they need to be rolled with some regularity or they get damaged. And so it is an important thing, because we have so many Torahs, which is awesome. We have to roll them so that they don't fall apart. But like I said, it is hard. I mean, it really takes some actual physical exertion to do, and we obviously haven't done it since COVID because we didn't want people getting all their germs all over everything. Yeah.
You got it. You didn't do it before? What? All right. Yeah. It's time. Has anybody ever had like an old wallet and just it starts to flake? Yeah. So that is what is happening to our scroll, our scroll from Czechoslovakia. The letters are literally peeling away from the page, and it's interesting because the sofer told me that I should be rolling it regularly, and it's like this destructive. I have to destroy in order to preserve. Yeah. It was really tough. I was like, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yeah, but at least 2 or 3 times a year. A Torah should be scrolled 2 or 3 times a week. That's how the leather on your wallet stays soft. It's intact. If you don't, it just begins to disintegrate. So yeah."
Beth.
Do. I really do.
Yeah.
Are we in from a reform perspective, or Judaism, or are we supposed to express praise, right? And then sandwich in the ass Judaism is how to pray and when to ask or not.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I never heard you're actually not supposed to
Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. So, all right. So the questions Beth is asking for those at home, one is if you wanted to go to a daily minyan, where could you go? And also, like, is there an order for things? Is there a right way to do it? So the first question is easy, which is to say that I don't believe at this time any of the Reform
But
synagogues.
if anybody wants to start one with me, I
Yeah.
need 10 people or
So-
9 people and a pet.
But this is the challenge, is that you do actually need traditionally 10 people to have a minyan. And so even at more conservative or even Orthodox shuls, they will wait until they can find those 10 people. And sometimes, like, I know, like from our friends at B'nai Emunah and Beis Abe, they'll like be calling around and they'll be like, oh, we can't get a minyan, you know, like, Rabbi Michael, what are you doing? And it has to be a man, by the way, for it to be official for them. So it's not something that we do in our synagogue. I think if we ever had a critical mass who wanted to, we absolutely could, but our job, and I think same with our Reform colleagues, is we are serving our community and what our community needs, and that if the community is not asking for this, we would rather do what the community needs at this time. The question about sort of the order of things and when you ask things, I'm going to answer it in a way that doesn't really answer it, which is to say that one thing that I think Judaism is really lacking is that many of us have a real discomfort with spontaneous prayer, because we have been taught for so long, this is the way you pray, this is the order in which you should pray, that when the time comes that you really want to ask for something, unless you really have a very active prayer life, a lot of times we feel stuck and embarrassed and we don't pray at all. And I've seen this the most over the years when I visited people in the hospitals and they're like, I don't even know what to say. By the way, that's why the Misha Baruch works so well, because that's the one prayer people know, and they're like, okay, we got that one. But I think that we lose something when we think I can only pray at different times. I mean, I would say, and I apologize for this, feels a little bit negative, but like my Yiddish answer would be besser wie nix, which means like, oh, it's better than nothing, right? Like, so I would rather you pray whatever the prayer is in your heart, even if it's not exactly the appropriate time or the right words. Better that you should pray than you should think I might mess it up, therefore I won't. That work?
Yeah. Sorry. I'm going to negate that so that you get 2 rabbis and 3 opinions at least. But I also agree with her. So I agree with her. I agree with you 100%. I really do. I think there's nothing more important than the personal prayer in terms of like, I want to say that as I think there's nothing more important. Your words are more of an offering than whatever Sadia Gaon came in the 7th century, which in order to combat the rise of Islam, by the way, same time period. It's very interesting. I think that there's something that we've lost in saying that this rubric doesn't have value, and that there is meaning in order. Because when there is no order, there's chaos. That's the antithesis of order. So you may feel chaos in your life, and approaching this narrative of history, spiritual history or spiritual space, I think offers something. Does it work all the time? Totally not. No. That's why there is personal prayer. And I gave a drash the other way, the prayer in the nighttime, just the waking up in the middle of the night and the words that you say because your heart is beating and you didn't want to be awake, you wanted to be asleep. But there's power to that. I feel like I wish that Hebrew wasn't such a barrier, and that literacy wasn't such a barrier. It's ironic that we have so many programs and so much literacy, and yet we still struggle with the ability to say the prayers. But I think that over time, we find that both have value, but that if you can even remember the Hebrew words and not learn all of Hebrew. I always have this discussion with B'nai Mitzvah students. You think that in Morocco in the 14th century that they went to Hebrew school and that they were, on Sundays and there was pickup on Tuesdays. And no, they were working in the fields picking chickpeas. And there might be a chazan or a person who knows all of the Jewish texts who has them by song memorized. And the way we memorize them, thank God for Rabbi Amy, is through song. And you do not have to be literate at all to know Hebrew or the Hebrew service. You do not have to go to Hebrew school. You just have to sit and listen. They are all just sacred songs that are made up of different sounds. How we go into them and what meaning we take of them becomes what it becomes. But just the idea of sitting down and say, I will dedicate myself to singing sacred songs for a period of time is a powerful idea.
So we only have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure that we finish up. The microphone's separate. I want to be sure that we finish up Aleinu, and then talk about Kaddish. So Carla, this is for you. Okay, so on page 284 is part of the Aleinu that we only sometimes say. And usually Rabbi Michael and I, we turn to the Ark towards Aleinu, we look at our watches, and we say, how much time do we have left? Is Carla here? And if Carla is here...
We do not do that, please.
Well, I mean, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
No, so there is a part of the Aleinu that's on the top of the page that is not as traditionally done in the Reform service, but that for folks who might have grown up more observant, they know this, and they like, and we both really like this too, so we will add it in, but we don't teach it in our religious school or in our Hebrew school only just because it's an additional piece that usually they haven't learned by the time of bar or bat mitzvah. But I will also say at the bottom of the page is a part of the Aleinu that we never say, and even though the Reform movement has cleaned it up, it's still a little bit nasty, because part of the Aleinu is really to say, as Rabbi Michael was saying before, it's also to say, won't it be great when one day everyone is Jewish, right? Which is so not what we believe. That is not who we are, but there was this time in Judaism that really said, one day everyone will bow to God, and that's not who we are. So we took out a lot of that prayer, and then there are parts that we just don't say. I also just want to say for this piece that the Aleinu is something that at least when I was growing up Reform, we never said this in Hebrew. We always did English. Let us adore the ever-living God, right? And render praise. I mean, it was really like a very churchy song. And it's still one of those days that if people were like, what's your Aleinu? Like, that's totally my Aleinu. Like that's the one that I grew up and I still really love it. Even though when I sing it now, I realize like it was absolutely taken from a church song and is not really how we do prayers today, but that I grew up sort of loving that English. So since we just have a few minutes, I just want to make sure that we do talk about the Mourner's Kaddish, which is on page 294. And there's two things that I think need to be said about this. There's lots of things, actually. I know. So we'll go through it relatively quickly. So one, this is a prayer that's in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. This is like the language that Jesus probably spoke. It sounds a lot like Hebrew, but it's not exactly. And you can tell for those of you who are learning your Hebrew, at the end of a lot of words, there's an aleph. That's one of the signs that you know something is written in Aramaic instead of Hebrew.
It's sort of like the Middle Eastern version of the Southern drawl.
Yeah.
It sounds a little different.
Yeah, that's good. So it does. And you'll also notice that if someone maybe came from an Ashkenazi background, they may also say those letters differently. And we talked about that last time. They may say Yiskadal v'Yiskada Shemei Rabbah, which is just a different way to say that.
Just one note on Aramaic. A certain version of Aramaic is still alive and spoken in Syria even today.
So what I want to point out, though, is two things. One about the text of this prayer, and the other is about when we say it. So this is a prayer that we never say in English, but we should, because all this prayer is, it's a doxology. It is just a prayer whose sole purpose is to praise God. Doesn't talk about death at all. In fact, even though you can see the translation here, a lot of people will say that it's very similar to the Lord's Prayer, that it really is just talking about how good God is. And it's interesting that we say it here as the Kaddish, as the Mourner's Kaddish. But what's fascinating is that the Kaddish did not start out just being this prayer that we all say for someone who died. And that's why in a more traditional service, you might have multiple Kaddishes throughout the service, because it really served as sort of a like a semicolon in the text. to sort of separate one part of the prayer service for the next. Now, we know that actually when the Kaddish started, that it used to be, it was still for mourners, but it would really be for a small enough group of people that, let's say Rabbi Michael had someone that he was mourning and Joel had someone he was mourning, that each of them would get their own Kaddish that they could say just by themselves in the text. And what happened was that as communities started getting bigger and bigger, there were just too many Kaddishes. And there were so many throughout the text that it became like you had it again and again and again throughout the service. So one of the things that the Reform movement did when we abbreviated the service is we were like, enough with the freaking Kaddishes. Like, we really don't need all that. And so we really centered on just one mourner's Kaddish that would be for everyone. Now, that was a long historical evolution to get to that point, but that's really why we just do this one at the end. The mourner's Kaddish is also something that is different in every community that you go to in terms of what the practice is. Our practice here is that everyone rises for the Kaddish, and we do that in honor of people whose names we read, but also in people who have no one left to say Kaddish for them. A lot of communities, the only people who will rise during the mourner's Kaddish are people who are in mourning at that time. And that's just something that is one community might prefer it over another. But for us, and this is done a lot actually after the Holocaust, was this idea of we should all rise for people who have no one left to say.
So what is also significant in terms of just the choreography is that sometimes in congregations that's not the case, and only mourners rise. This is a very dramatic thing to see. It identifies and separates those who are mourning. And some people find this very important and powerful. And some people find it very difficult to take and lonely, if not sometimes embarrassing or awkward. So the compromise that I think in light of what you said also about the Holocaust, it was over time we began to all rise. But I sometimes wonder if that's not necessarily helpful for us, because in a community where someone's really, really struggling, we're able to identify who that person is, maybe come over after the service. But at the same time, sometimes people want anonymity and they don't want to be identified. The same is true, I would say, for Misha Baruch. Misha Baruch is critically important because it is informative to the community. I was once with Roderick, Burton, Pastor Roderick Burton, and I was in his church mass, and I was about to go into announcements, and I rolled my eyes and I kind of made a joke to him, and he said, no. And I said, what do you mean? He said, this was the opportunity when slaves were being traded, how we could find out about where each other was and how we could reconnect with another. And after hearing his story about that, the idea of allowing people to rise in a synagogue and speak for a moment is something that I find to be a tremendously important thing.
So, my friends, oh yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, my friends, we are going to conclude here. We know some of you have to go pick up your kids from religious school. This has been awesome. If you want to stay around and say hello to people, feel free, because we have some people who are here for the first time. But what I would also say is we are probably going to do another version of this class later, because even though we got through the gist of the service, we didn't get through any of the Kabbalat Shabbat stuff or any of the Torah service stuff. So probably after the secular year, we will do another version. But thank you so much for being here. Stay around, schmooze, talk to people. Here we will do another version, but thank you so much for being